Hey everyone, Unit 3, Day 3. Um, Buckle up because we're going to talk about video games today. I promise it's relevant and it's going to be the main focus of my contribution today because a lot of what you guys have been saying has um, gotten me to think about this one example in particular. Um, Shannon, this is it most directly has to do with your most recent video contribution. You were talking a lot about how somebody that you knew has experience in coding video games, and about how whether or not you can consider that an art form. He didn't see it as art, he or she didn't see it as art, but you saw it as art. And so, that got me sort of thinking about, video games again, of course. Um, Sarah, in your video, you were talking about how technology seems to be a bit of, I think you called it an intermediary step. And it got me thinking to how well, you also mentioned that when you see a digital painting, despite the fact that that can be exhibited somewhere or showcased somewhere, you do find yourself having a little bit of a disconnect from it. And I can I can understand that. You inevitably compare it to a real painting, where like you have a bit more power to um, paint what it is that you're trying to paint. Like watercolor paints and painting, for example, like the manipulation of colors and the way that they spread throughout a canvas can be absolutely completely controlled based upon an artist's technique. Whereas in a computer, it's just sort of automatically done for you based upon your user preferences. So I can see how there would be a little bit of a disconnect there. You can still put as much passion and emotion into it as possible and create something that truly represents what you were trying to create and put out into the world. But does the technique of creating the end results through a computer make it art? Or is, art in the traditional sense of holding a brush and controlling it, is that only what art can be, you know? And Rosa, again, this sort of ties into what you were saying about the different methods of creating your flower, electronically versus physically, I guess you can say. So all of this stuff led me to think about, is coding something, whether it be a video game or I don't know, what have you, is coding something an art form? Can you compare writing in code to software to the manipulation of a paintbrush? They're both still calculations that a human is undergoing. They're just calculations that are performed in a different way. So they're in their different categories, but does that does that mean that one of those categories isn't art? That category being coding and computing. So the example that I wanted to discuss at length today is a video game called Okami. And this video game is set in classical Japanese history, and it deals a lot with Japanese myths, legends, and folklore, and you get to experience and interact with Japanese culture in a very um, revolutionary way. This game is very rooted in Japanese storytelling, and you play as this wolf that is an incarnation of the Shinto sun goddess Amaterasu. So it's very heavily themed in Japanese folklore. The art style of this video game is made up of, I think it's Sumi-e Japanese painting. Let me look on my computer so that I could be a bit more specific. This technique is called inkwash painting. And what inkwash painting is an East Asian type of brush painting of Chinese origin that uses black ink in various concentrations. This was originated in China, of course, and it was typically used to depict landscapes, a lot of mountains and mist, and depending upon how much ink or how hard you press your brush against your canvas, it has different sorts of effects in portraying what it is that you're trying to portray. So it's a very traditional Chinese and Japanese art form. And this video game uses this art form to, I guess you could say, express itself, to create a world that looks as if you are playing within one of these inkwash paintings. And the effect is magnificent. It's totally engaging with not only technology, but with art in such a great way. It's almost like a dichotomy, you know? There's always this debate of whether or not video games can be considered an art form, you know? And this relates to computer art, in that, you know, video games are created through computers. So say, you know, relating that back to the exhibition in New York on the computer generated images, you know, whether or not that was considered art, you know, it seemed cold and soulless, and it was hard to relate to, and it was, you know, it felt like you had that barrier of the technology that you were using, or the technology that was used to make this art. It just felt like a barrier. This video game, I feel, marriages these two worlds in such a clear way. And I'll go ahead and include a little video along with my video contribution, just so that you guys can see what it is that I'm talking about. There's no way that something like this could have been created if the programmers, if the developers of this video game did not have an understanding of this art form, and not only an understanding of it and an appreciation of it, but the ability to create and work in this genre of art. You know, when you're creating a video game, there's a process that you go through where you create what's called concept art. And that is essentially drawing, painting, sculpting, what have you, the characters and story. It's sort of like storyboarding for a movie, for a film. Concept art is what you use to create images of what it is that you want to create in your video game. So all of the concept art for this video game is done in the style of inkwash painting. And the effect is, again, magnificent. So I think that this is an example of computer generated art that removes the barrier that technology might seem to bring, because as it's a video game, it's completely, entirely interactive. So you're manipulating this world, you're controlling this world while playing as, you know, a goddess that is based upon the Shinto religion, and you learn about the culture of Japan in such a unique way, and it's marvelous. And another thing that I think is interesting about the painting is not only is it inspired by the art itself, it's inspired, the art of inkwash painting, it's inspired by the act of creating the inkwash painting, because a mechanic in the video game is that you can control the world by using a paintbrush. So what happens is say you're walking around in a field. You press the button and the screen turns into a canvas. And on this canvas, you can control a paintbrush and draw, say, like, I don't know, a bomb. And drawing that bomb allows you to interact with this world in that you paint a bomb's created, blows up. Something blows up in the video game. And it's just fascinating how something like that, they could have done that in so many different ways, but they decided, you know what, not only are we going to allow users to interact with a painting by having it set in a painting, we're going to let you paint as well, so that you can kind of get an idea of how this art is created. You can control how hard that paintbrush touches the canvas. You can control how quick the brush strokes are to create different textures. And another thing is it's just fascinating. And I think that this is a decent example of the removal of a barrier to creating technology, creating an idea of the use of technology that's warm and appreciative of traditional artwork. I guess physical artwork would be a bit more of a better way of saying that. If you haven't seen ink wash painting, which I'm sure you all have, it's marvelous. It's really wonderful. There's this, again, all the names are in Japanese, so in pronouncing these names, I butcher them. But there's one example in particular called Autumn Landscape, and it's by Sesshu Toyo. And I think I'll go ahead and include that in my submission as well, so that you can see the two examples side by side. But it's just marvelous in the way that it creates shapes and the ways that it replicates depth. And I know this isn't computer generated art, but again, it just ties into this video game Okami, and that it just so perfectly replicates the art that is in the real world through the use of a computer, while at the same time being its own original piece of artwork. It's just fascinating to me. And I would love to see more examples of that in computer generated art, because again, I think that that's just a very great way of removing the barrier that one might experience in working with electronics. So yeah, I'll go ahead and include that with this video submission. I'm sorry if I kind of lost you guys a little bit. I know I talk about video games a little bit much. I'm very enthusiastic about them, but I think that it's very, especially in this week, it's very applicable in that it's computer generated art. And, people have different opinions of that, but I feel like this Okami in particular is a very good example for the argument that video games are art. And it's a very successful form of computer generated art. So thank you guys for leading me to thinking of this example. I hope this wasn't too boring. Thanks for listening to me. I'll see you guys later. Bye.